Marco Polo, His Travels and Adventures, Chapter 5, Part 2. He soon found himself once more on the edge of the great desert and came to a large and ancient city called Azina, which was more than half in ruins. He soon learned that it had once been a thriving capital and had been taken by the famous Tartar warrior Genghis Khan. Now it was inhabited by a roving and sport-loving population who only lived in it in summer, descending into the valleys and there dwelling in the winter season. These people were much given to the rearing of camels and horses, and were exceedingly fond of hunting in the vast pine forests that spread over the neighboring hills. From Azina, Marco went to a still larger city of Karakorum, which seemed to him at least 3 miles in circumference, and which, as he heard, had once been the capital of the Tartar conquerors of China. It stood on a very picturesque spot. A beautiful river flowed near its walls, on the banks of which were numberless tents occupied by wandering Tartar tribes who preferred this mode of life to dwelling in the city itself. The mountains were not far off, and on many a crag and spur Marco could espy the lordly castles where once had dwelt the proud Tartar nobles. It was at Karakorum that Marco for the first time heard the wonderful story of the conquests of Genghis Khan, the mighty Tartar chief whose descendant, Kublai Khan, was then reigning in Cathay. He listened with rapt attention to the accounts which some of the natives, whose acquaintance he made, gave of the terrific battle in which Genghis Khan had overthrown the haughty tyrant, Prester John, and had himself won sway over all the surrounding region. Genghis Khan, it seemed, had asked Prester John to give him his daughter to wife, and Prester John had returned a haughty refusal. "What is this, Genghis Khan?" Prester John had exclaimed, "but my dog and slave. Go and let him know that I would burn my daughter to ashes before I would give her to him. Tell him he is a dog and a traitor." Genghis Khan was beside himself with rage when he heard this insulting message, and swore that he would humble Prester John's pride in the dust. He gathered in all haste a vast Tartar army and sent word to Prester John to defend himself as best he could. Then Genghis invaded his foe's territory, and on the beautiful plain of Tenduk met Prester John's forces in terrible conflict. The battle raged furiously for 2 days, at the end of which the invaders' victory was complete. Prester John himself fell dead in the midst of his host, and Genghis Khan overran his kingdom without resistance. Thus the Tartars had come into the possession of all China, from the great desert to the eastern seas, and everywhere, in the region where Marco now was, he saw the vestiges of their wars and triumphs. During his expeditions, Marco saw and heard much that was interesting about the Tartars. He found that everywhere he went, they were in the habit of living on the sides of the mountains in summer and in the sunny and well-watered valleys in the winter. They could move their residence thus easily, as the tents they lived in were made of felt, and being very light, could readily be carried from place to place. They were so superstitious that they always placed the openings of their tents to the south, as to put them in any other way was a bad omen. The Tartar men did nothing but hunt and go to war. Their wives did all the homework, the trading, and the cultivating of the fields. They lived principally on milk and the game they brought in from the forests and fields, though sometimes Marco found them feasting on the flesh of camels and even dogs. These Tartars had each many wives, but they always held the wife they first married in the highest esteem. Husbands and wives were strictly faithful to each other, and a marriage was always the occasion of a great deal of feasting and merrymaking. Each Tartar family had an idol of its own, made, curiously enough, of cloth, and very queer-looking things, like rude dolls, did these idols seem to Marco. The idol was placed in a little room apart, and by his side were smaller idols, representing his wife and children. Before the family ate, they smeared the idol's mouth with some fat meat and laid some pieces of bread at his feet. The richer Tartars, Marco observed, were often very handsomely attired in robes of silk fringed with gold. and in coats made of many beautiful furs. The soldiers had clubs, swords, and bows and arrows, in the use of the latter of which they were very expert. When they went to war, they wore heavy buffalo cloaks, which served as armor. While Marco was away on one of his jaunts, he one day received a message from his father, saying that the war which had delayed them was now over, and urging him to hasten back to Campisian, that they might proceed on their journey. He therefore hurried back, and as soon as he had arrived, the party once more set out. They had been detained at Campisian no less than a year. No wonder that they were tired of their long wanderings. The travelers now passed through scenes marked by the ravages of a ferocious war. In some places the villages were entirely laid waste. In others, half-burned cities betrayed the savage nature of the contest. At last they emerged again into a pleasant and thriving region, and soon found themselves in the lovely plain of Tenduk, where, long before, the great battle between Genghis Khan and Prester John had been fought. Here Marco was surprised to learn that most of the inhabitants were Christians, and he saw for himself that they were very industrious, and were prosperous farmers and skillful artisans. This was the country which, it was said, was once upon a time ruled over by two mighty giants named Gog and Magog. Marco heard with delight that Tenduk was not many days' journey from the place where at last his eyes would be gratified with the sight of Kublai, the great Khan. The travelers were already in Cathay, and the end of their long wanderings was near. They had learned that Kublai Khan was at his summer palace in Shandu, in the northern part of his dominions, and they had accordingly directed their course thither. Niccolo knew well that they would be most warmly welcomed when they came into the Tartar sovereign presence, for when he had been in Cathay before, he had found it difficult to get away from the Khan's court. As they approached the goal of their travels, the Venetians passed through a more and more thickly settled country, and larger and richer cities, until one morning they arrived at an imposing place called Sayanganor, where were a stately palace and a vast park belonging to the Khan. This was only a 3 days' journey from Shandu, and Niccolo resolved to stay here until he had sent forward a messenger to Kublai Khan to apprise him of their coming and to receive his reply. They had not long to wait, for within a week their messenger returned with a numerous and brilliant cavalcade which the Khan had dispatched to escort the Venetians to his palace. At the same time he sent word that he was awaiting their arrival with great impatience. No time was lost in setting out for Shandu, the road to which lay through a smiling and thickly settled country. On the third day, about noon, they had arrived within sight of the vast palace which served the Khan as his summer residence, and beyond which stretched out for miles the hunting grounds where he enjoyed the rough pastimes of the chase. As the travelers approached nearer, they perceived a great multitude of horsemen coming towards them, and soon one of their escort exclaimed that the Khan himself was there. Marco eagerly strained his eyes in the direction of those who were approaching, and pretty soon was able to perceive a huge elephant in the midst of the horsemen, upon whose back appeared a glittering canopy of silk and gold. It was indeed the Khan, coming out to welcome his guests. As soon as he was near enough, the Khan descended from his elephant, and the Polos and their party leaped from their horses upon the ground. Niccolo, Maffeo, and Marco advanced toward the monarch with bowed heads and fell at his feet. Kublai gently raised the brothers and warmly embraced one, and then the other. "Good Venetians," he said, "I am filled with joy to see you. Welcome back to Cathay. You have kept your promise to return, and I am grateful to you. But who," he asked, turning to Marco, "is this comely youth?" "Sire," replied Niccolo, "he is your Majesty's servant, my son." The Khan looked at Marco from head to foot, and advancing to him smiled very pleasantly. "Then," said he, "your son is also welcome. I am much pleased with him." Once more mounting, the three Polos rode by the Khan's side until they reached the palace. That evening the Khan gave a great feast in honor of the travelers' arrival, and that night the Polos found themselves luxuriously lodged in some of the best apartments the imperial palace afforded.